I spent my whole life thinking I was eating right until my knees stopped listening to me at 84. That's not the kind of thing that happens overnight. It sneaks up on you. One morning, you go to get out of bed, and there's this deep, grinding ache in both knees that wasn't there 10 years ago. Or at least you told yourself it wasn't. You stand at the kitchen counter, and your legs feel like they belong to somebody older than you. And I remember thinking, I'm 84 years old. Maybe this is just what 84 feels like. Maybe I should accept it. I didn't accept it. And I'm glad I didn't, because I'm 92 now, and I walk to the end of my street and back every single morning without a cane, without holding on to anything, without wincing. My knees don't swell. They don't throb at night. They carry me. And the story of how that happened is not the story I expected to tell, because it's not really about what I added to my life. It's mostly about what I finally had the sense to throw out. Let me go back a little, because context matters here. I grew up during the Depression, and if you know anything about that era, you know that eating healthy meant eating whatever was on the table and being grateful for it. White bread was a staple. Margarine appeared in our kitchen sometime in the 1940s and stayed for decades because it was cheap, and we'd been told it was better for us than butter. Saturday mornings meant sweet rolls from the bakery 2 blocks over. Soft, sticky, glazed things that I genuinely loved. These weren't treats. They were just Tuesday. They were just life. And for a long time, nothing seemed wrong. My knees worked fine in my 50s, fine in my 60s, mostly fine through my 70s. A little stiffness here and there, but I chalked that up to age, to standing on hard floors, to the weather changing. I never once looked at what I was eating and thought, that might be the problem. Then came 84, and everything changed. My doctor at the time was a practical woman who didn't sugarcoat things. She looked at my x-rays, looked at me, and said the cartilage in both my knees was breaking down. Inflammation, she said. Chronic, low-grade inflammation that had been building for years. She mentioned anti-inflammatory medications. She mentioned physical therapy, and I listened to all of it. But there was one thing she said almost in passing that I couldn't let go of. She said that some of the most consistent drivers of joint inflammation are dietary mentals, and that they're often the foods people eat every day without a second thought. I drove home that afternoon and stood in my kitchen and looked around at everything in my refrigerator and my pantry with completely different eyes. Here is what I saw. A loaf of white sandwich bread that I bought every week. A tub of margarine I'd been using since practically the Eisenhower administration. A box of glazed donuts I'd picked up at the store because they were on sale. A bottle of vegetable oil, the big kind. Crackers, the cheap, salty ones. And in the freezer, a few packages of processed meat I used for sandwiches. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think a lot of people reading this might be standing in their own kitchens right now, looking at something similar. And I want to tell you what I learned about each of those things, because understanding the why was what finally made me take it seriously. White bread first. Refined flour spikes blood sugar quickly, and when blood sugar spikes repeatedly, day after day, it triggers an inflammatory response throughout the body. Your joints are not immune to that response. I think of the cartilage in a knee the way I think of a sponge. It absorbs whatever the fluid around it is carrying. If that fluid is consistently carrying inflammatory compounds, the sponge gets saturated with them. It gets stiff, brittle, less able to cushion the impact of every step. For 80-something years, I had been feeding that sponge a steady diet of refined flour. I just didn't know it. The margarine was harder for me to let go of psychologically, because I had been told for decades that it was the healthy choice. But margarine, especially the old-fashioned kind, and honestly a lot of the newer kinds too, is loaded with partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats. And those fats are among the most reliably inflammatory things you can put in your body. They don't just pass through. They get incorporated into cell membranes, and they make those membranes more prone to triggering inflammatory signals. For your joints, that's a slow disaster. A quiet one. Nothing you'd notice in a single week or a single month, but over decades, I believe it made a real difference, and not in a good way. The sweet rolls and donuts. This one is almost too obvious once you understand the mechanism, but I'll say it anyway. Refined sugar is one of the most potent dietary drivers of inflammation we know about. It activates pathways in the body that produce compounds called cytokines, which promote swelling and pain in joints. Every time I had something sweet and starchy for breakfast, and I did this many, many mornings, I was essentially pouring a little more acid into that sponge. Not dramatic, acid right now acid. Quiet acid. The kind that takes 30 years to show up on an X-ray. Now, I want to be honest with you. I didn't cut all of this out in a single day and immediately feel 40 again. That's not how this works, and anyone who tells you that is selling something. What I did was make a decision to stop replacing these things when they ran out. When the white bread was gone, I bought a small loaf of whole grain sourdough instead. Real sourdough. The kind made with just flour, water, and salt. Because the fermentation process actually lowers the glycemic impact significantly. When the margarine ran out, I bought a small amount of real butter. A little real butter is not the enemy. The fake stuff was. I found an olive oil I liked. I started keeping walnuts on the counter instead of crackers. Walnuts are one of the few foods with a genuinely meaningful concentration of omega-3 fatty acids, which actively work against inflammation rather than feeding it. I started eating more oily fish. I started putting turmeric in things, not because it's trendy, but because the research on curcumin and joint inflammation is actually quite solid. And more than that, I liked the taste. But here is the thing I want to emphasize, because it surprised me. The food changes were only part of it. There were 2 other habits in my daily life that I believe were doing just as much damage, and I hadn't thought of either of them as problems at all. The first was how much I sat without moving. I was 84. I was retired. I had a comfortable chair and a television I liked, and good books I wanted to read. Sitting for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours at a stretch felt natural, felt restful, felt earned. But here is what happens when a joint stays in the same position for hours. The synovial fluid that lubricates it, that's the fluid that keeps cartilage alive and cushioned, stops circulating properly. Cartilage doesn't have its own blood supply. It depends entirely on that fluid moving through it, delivering nutrients, carrying away waste. When you sit still for hours, you're essentially starving your cartilage. The sponge dries out. And a dry sponge, when pressure is applied to it, doesn't compress, it cracks. I started setting a timer. Every 45 minutes, I stood up. I walked to the window. I did a few slow knee bends if I felt up to it. That was all. But the difference in stiffness by the end of the day was noticeable within the first 2 weeks. It sounds almost too simple to be real. And I understand if you're skeptical. I was skeptical too. But the biology behind it is not complicated. The second habit was something my own mother used to warn me about, and I had spent 80+ years ignoring her. Cold floors. I had hardwood floors throughout most of my apartment, and I was the kind of person who shuffled to the kitchen in the morning in bare feet or thin socks and thought nothing of it. What I didn't understand is that cold causes the muscles and connective tissue around joints to contract and tighten. When those tissues are chronically cold and tight, they pull on the joint with more force than they should, and that adds up to stress on the cartilage over time. More than that, cold slows circulation locally, and circulation is how your joints get rid of inflammation. I started wearing real house slippers, the kind with actual support and insulation, every single morning, without exception. My mother would have said, "I told you so," and she would have been right. So by the time I had been at this for about a year, eating differently, moving every 45 minutes, keeping my joints warm, things had changed enough that I noticed. The grinding had quieted. The morning stiffness was shorter. I wasn't gripping the kitchen counter when I stood up. I felt like my knees were mine again. And then I added the last piece, which is the part I want to describe carefully because I think it's often misunderstood. It's a bedtime ritual, and it has two components. The first is a warm compress on both knees before I sleep. I use a heating pad set to low. Nothing complicated, nothing expensive. I put it on each knee for about 15 minutes. The warmth dilates the small blood vessels in and around the joint, increases local circulation, helps the synovial fluid move more freely. It's the same principle as warming up before exercise, except gentler. I think of it as tucking my knees in for the night, the way you'd tuck a child in, making sure they're warm, making sure they're settled before the long hours of stillness. The second component is a short stretching sequence. I do this in bed, lying on my back. I pull each knee slowly toward my chest, hold it for 20 or 30 seconds. Feel the pull through the back of the leg and the hip. Then I straighten the leg fully, flex the foot, hold that for 10 seconds. Then the other side. Then I do a slow, gentle rotation at the ankle on each side. The whole thing takes maybe 8 minutes. What it does is lengthen the muscles and connective tissue that have been working and contracting all day, reduces the tension they're putting on the joint through the night, and encourages one more round of synovial fluid circulation before sleep. I have done this every single night for 8 years. Not most nights, every night. And I believe that consistency is actually the heart of it. Not any single technique, not any miracle ingredient, but the simple fact of doing something kind for your joints every day without exception. I'm 92. I don't say that to impress anyone. I say it because I think a lot of people my age, and honestly, a lot of people much younger than me, have accepted a level of joint pain that they don't have to accept. I accepted it myself for a few years. I thought it was the natural consequence of time, of age, of use. And some of it is. I'm not going to tell you that an 84-year-old's cartilage is the same as a 40-year-old's. It isn't. But I also didn't realize how much of what I was experiencing wasn't time. It was years of quietly pouring acid into a sponge and then wondering why the sponge wasn't working right. The part that still sits with me all these years later is how ordinary everything was. The white bread wasn't a vice, it was breakfast. The margarine wasn't an indulgence, it was a health choice, or so I thought. The long afternoons in the chair, the bare feet on cold floors in January, none of it felt wrong. None of it felt like anything at all. I wonder sometimes if that's the hardest thing about this kind of slow damage. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, quietly, year after year, until one morning you reach for the coffee pot and your knees remind you that they've been trying to tell you something for a very long time. I think about my daughter, who is 68 now, and mentions her knees more often than she used to. I think about friends of mine who are in their 70s and have started carrying that small stiffness everywhere they go, that careful way of lowering themselves into chairs, that brief hesitation at the bottom of stairs. I wonder if any of this sounds familiar to them. I wonder if it sounds familiar to you. Because what I know now, what 8 years of pain-free mornings has taught me, is that the body at almost any age is more responsive than we give it credit for. Not infinitely so, and not immediately so, but genuinely, meaningfully responsive. It wants to reduce inflammation if you stop feeding it inflammation. It wants to circulate and cushion if you give it movement and warmth. It wants to recover during the night if you give it 8 minutes of care before sleep. I threw out the white bread. I threw out the margarine. I threw out the habit of sitting like a stone for half a day and the habit of walking on cold floors in January like I was invincible. Those were the things that changed my knees. Not the things I added, but the things I finally had the sense to remove. The compress and the stretching came last, and they sealed it, but they only work the way they do because I'd already cleaned house. That's the part nobody talks about. You can do all the evening routines you want, but if you're still feeding the inflammation all day, you're bailing out a boat with a teacup. I'm 92 years old, and my knees carried me down the street this morning, and they'll carry me there again tomorrow. And if you had told me that at 84, when I was gripping the kitchen counter and trying not to let my face show how much it hurt to stand up, I'm not sure I would have believed you. But here we are. I'd be curious to know, have you ever traced a persistent ache or problem in your body back to something you were doing every single day without thinking about it? Not a dramatic injury, not a specific incident, just a quiet daily habit you finally caught? I think about that question a lot. The answers are usually humbling, and they're usually in plain sight.